The baby wasn't just abandoned. She was delivered like a burden, left on a hardened cowboy's porch with a single note that would change his life forever. Asterisk, she's yours now. I don't want her. Asterisk, the storm had been building all evening, a restless wind sweeping across the plains like it had something to prove, rattling shutters and bending the tall grass flat against the earth. And Caleb Turner had no intention of stepping back outside once he'd shut his door for the night. He'd spent the entire day mending broken fence posts under a merciless sky, his hands raw, his patience thinner than usual, and the last thing he needed was trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him anyway, and that night it came in the form of a sound so faint he almost ignored it, a soft, uneven cry that barely cut through the howl of the wind, the kind of sound that could be mistaken for a dying animal if a man didn't listen closely enough. Caleb paused mid-step, his instincts sharpening, his head tilting slightly as the sound came again, more desperate this time, and with a quiet curse under his breath. He grabbed the lantern by the door and pulled it open, the wind immediately slamming into him. Like a warning he chose to ignore, his boots heavy against the wooden porch as the flickering light revealed something that hadn't been there minutes before. A basket, small and out of place, sitting near the edge as if whoever left it hadn't cared whether it stayed or slid off into the mud below. Caleb didn't move at first, his jaw tightening as he stared at it, because nothing good ever came from things left unannounced in the dead of night, especially not on a ranch as far removed from town as his. And yet the cry came again, weaker now, forcing him forward despite every instinct telling him to turn around and shut the door. He crouched slowly, the lantern trembling slightly in his grip as he pulled back the thin, damp cloth covering the basket. And there she was, a newborn, impossibly small, her face red from the cold, her tiny fists clenched like she was already fighting a world that hadn't given her a fair chance. And for a brief second, Caleb just stared, his mind blank, as if refusing to understand what he was looking at, because this didn't fit into the life he knew, didn't belong in the quiet, controlled solitude he'd built for himself over the years. Then he noticed the note, pinned carelessly to the blanket, the paper already curling at the edges from the moisture in the air, and he hesitated before taking it, as though reading it would make the situation real in a way he couldn't undo. But he read it anyway, his eyes narrowing as the simple, brutal words. Settle then. Asterisk, she's yours now. I don't want her. Asterisk, no explanation, no name, no trace of hesitation, just a decision made and abandoned like it meant nothing. And something in Caleb shifted, something dark and familiar that he hadn't felt in a long time, because he knew that kind of rejection, knew what it meant to be left behind without answers. And for a moment he considered exactly what the person who left the child must have expected, that he'd take one look and ride her into town, hand her off to someone else, make her someone else's problem. But the baby let out a weak, broken cry, and that thought died before it could fully take shape. He glanced back at the open door, at the dim warmth inside that suddenly felt too far away, then back down at the fragile life in front of him, and before he could talk himself out of it, he reached in and lifted her carefully, awkwardly, like handling something far more delicate than anything he'd ever known, her weight almost non-existent, but somehow heavier than anything he'd carried in years. And the moment she was in his arms, the crying stopped, not completely, but enough that it caught him off guard, her tiny body settling just enough to make him hesitate, his rough hands suddenly unsure of themselves as he adjusted his grip. Yeah, that's right, he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her, his voice low and uneven as he stepped back inside and kicked the door shut against the storm. Quiet down. But she didn't need the command, her eyes barely open, her breathing shallow as she leaned into the warmth of the house. And Caleb stood there in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do next, because nothing in his life had prepared him for this. Not the years of working alone, not the long stretches of silence he'd grown used to, not even the hardships he'd endured before this place became his refuge. He looked around as if expecting answers to appear out of nowhere, his gaze landing on the table, the chair, the fire burning low in the hearth. None of it helpful, none of it meant for a child. And yet he didn't move to put her down, didn't even consider it, because despite everything, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface at whoever had done this, Despite the way the note echoed in his mind like an accusation, he couldn't ignore the simple truth in front of him. She had been left here to die, and whether he liked it or not, he was the only thing standing between her and that outcome. He exhaled slowly, a long, steady breath that seemed to carry the weight of the decision with it, and shook his head slightly, as if acknowledging a reality he hadn't chosen but couldn't refuse. "All right," he said quietly, his voice steadier now, more certain than he felt. "Guess it's you and me." And with that, the storm outside continued to rage. But inside the small, worn house on the edge of nowhere, something had already begun to change, even if Caleb Turner wasn't ready to admit it yet. The cowboy who had built his life on silence and routine quickly learned that a baby didn't care about either. And from the very first night, Caleb Turner realized just how unprepared he truly was. Sleep disappeared almost instantly, replaced by sharp, desperate cries that echoed through the small house no matter what he tried. Rocking her stiffly, pacing the floor, muttering low words that felt strange in his mouth. Nothing worked the way it should, and frustration crept in faster than he expected, pushing him more than once toward the thought of riding into town and leaving her somewhere safer, somewhere people actually knew what to do. But every time that thought surfaced, it crashed against the memory of the note, those cold words that refused to fade. "I don't want her," and Caleb found himself unable to become the second person to prove them true. The days that followed blurred into exhaustion, his old routine breaking apart and reshaping itself around the smallest life he'd ever been responsible for. Mornings no longer began with work, but with checking if she was still breathing, his chest tightening until he saw that faint rise and fall, and only then allowing himself to move, to think, to act. He learned quickly, not out of desire, but necessity, how to hold her without making her cry, how to warm milk without ruining it, how to tell what she needed by the sound of her voice. And though he wouldn't admit it, those small successes mattered more than anything he'd done on the ranch in years. He stopped going into town, avoided questions he didn't want to answer, and focused only on what was in front of him, the land, and the child who had somehow become part of it. Sometimes he carried her outside while he worked, bundled close against him, a sight that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew the man he used to be. Weeks passed, and the house began to change in ways he hadn't expected. The silence that once felt like control now felt empty without her, and Caleb found himself filling it without thinking, speaking to her in quiet, steady tones as he moved through his day. Words she couldn't understand, but that grounded him all the same. One evening, he built her a proper crib, sanding the wood more carefully than necessary, testing its strength twice before placing her inside, and when she settled peacefully, he stood there longer than he meant to, watching as if expecting the moment to break. Not long after, he gave her a name, Lily, because calling her nothing had started to feel wrong, and though he didn't say it aloud, the name meant more than he was ready to face. Slowly, impossibly, the chaos softened into something steady, something real, and Caleb began to accept that this life, this unexpected, fragile bond, wasn't temporary. But even as that thought settled in, something lingered just beyond it. A quiet reminder that choices like the one written on that note didn't simply disappear, and that sooner or later, the past would come looking for what it had left behind. The past didn't arrive with warning. It rode in quietly, like it had every right to be there. And by the time Caleb Turner saw her standing at the edge of his land, it was already too late to pretend this life hadn't changed him. The woman looked worn down by miles and mistakes, dust clinging to her clothes, her eyes fixed on the house with a kind of determination that didn't belong to someone uncertain. And Caleb knew before she even spoke who she was, the truth settling in his chest with a weight he couldn't ignore. "Where is she?" were the first words out of her mouth. No apology, no hesitation, just a demand that cut through the air sharper than any accusation. And for a moment, Caleb didn't answer, not because he didn't hear her, but because he was measuring something deeper than her words. The distance between who she had been the night she left that basket on his porch and who she was now standing in front of him. "Inside," he said finally, his voice steady but guarded, "sleeping." And when she took a step forward, he didn't move to stop her, though every instinct told him he should, because this wasn't just about anger or blame anymore. It was about Lily. "I came to take her back," she said. And that was the moment everything tightened. the fragile balance Caleb had built over the past weeks threatening to crack under the weight of a choice he'd never expected to face. He studied her closely, searching for something: regret, selfishness, truth. And what he found wasn't as simple as he wanted it to be. "You left her to die," he said, not raising his voice, but not softening it either, and the words landed hard enough to make her flinch, though she didn't look away. "I saved her," she shot back, her voice breaking just enough to betray the strain beneath it. "I knew someone here would take her in." And Caleb shook his head slowly, that familiar edge of frustration surfacing. "You didn't know anything," he replied, quieter now, but no less firm. "You just didn't want her." That was the truth he'd carried since the night he found the note, the truth that had shaped every decision since. But it wasn't the whole truth, and for the first time, the woman let that show. She told him what she hadn't written, what she hadn't been able to leave behind on a piece of paper, that she had nothing, no home, no safety, and people looking for her who would have used the child as leverage, that leaving Lily wasn't about indifference but fear, the kind that forces choices no one should have to make. "I thought she'd be safer with a stranger," she said quietly, and Caleb let the words settle, not accepting them outright, but not dismissing them either, because he understood something about desperation, even if he didn't agree with what it led people to do. "She is," he answered after a long pause, and that was what finally broke her, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the quiet collapse of someone who had carried too much for too long, her composure slipping as she stepped inside the house, drawn toward the small crib near the fire like it was the only thing that mattered. Caleb watched from a distance as she saw Lily for the first time since the night she let her go, the moment hitting her all at once as she dropped to her knees beside the crib, her hands trembling, her breath uneven, and for a while, neither of them spoke, because there wasn't anything simple enough to say. When she finally looked up at him, there was no demand left in her expression, no certainty, just honesty. "I don't deserve her," she admitted, and Caleb nodded slightly, not out of cruelty, but because it was the truth they both had to face. "Maybe not," he said, his voice steady. "But this isn't about what we deserve." And he stepped closer then, not as a man defending what was his, but as someone who understood that Lily's future couldn't be decided by pride or guilt alone. "She deserves better than being left behind," he continued, glancing down at the child who had unknowingly changed both their lives. "And she deserves the truth someday." And the weight of that hung between them, shifting the question from who had the right to her, to what kind of life they were willing to give her. The woman lowered her gaze, her shoulders heavy with the realization that love wasn't always enough to undo what had already been done, and Caleb exhaled slowly, the tension easing just enough for something else to take its place. Not forgiveness, not fully, but understanding. "You can stay," he said after a moment, the decision surprising even him as it settled into place, "for now." And when she looked up, unsure, he added, "We figure it out, the right way." Because walking away again wouldn't fix anything, and neither would shutting her out completely. Outside, the land stretched on as it always had, unchanged and indifferent. But inside that small house, something new had taken root. Not just between a man and a child, but between two people bound by a choice neither of them could undo. And for the first time since that stormy night, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something they might be able to build, together, one careful step at a time.